Nova York acorda tranquila. Há alguns dias a cidade levou dois grandes sustos, um terremoto e um furacão. Não foi nada, quase nenhum dano, mas mexeram com a ferida, aberta há 10 anos. As cicatrizes de 11 de setembro não fecharam. A gente acha que superou, mas o trauma, o medo, a ansiedade, a qualquer ameaça, voltam. É uma coisa até difícil de explicar. Talvez fosse melhor refletir em silêncio. Ou melhor ainda, ouvir a voz de um poeta.
Hell, the horrific, into the routine. Glass and metal can be identified, not the atoms of human ash. I set down thoughts, sequences of images, of emotions dissolved in a mass, encoded in the brain. The depth or the width of the hatred measured from so high up, the time it takes for those who are falling. Is it that reality disjointed cannot be discerned, or the consciousness disjointed cannot discern it? There are these vicious circles of accumulated causation. Irreal is the word. I know of no defense against those addicted to death.
Did you feel that with these scares of earthquake, hurricane, that people got back that feeling of anxiety and fear? So the scars of 9/11 are really not closed?
Well, no, I mean, for those of us who were directly affected by it, no, I don't think it'll ever go away. You develop an imagination for the horrible, because the horrible occurred. It's affected everybody that saw the pictures of it and everything else. For those who directly had to worry about safety and life and helping others, and damage and destruction I think went into a kind of mental space that will never leave them.
You mentioned what it really means is something that was already forgotten. What do you mean by that?
If you look at the amount of suffering that people suffered as a result of this, and then you go the next step and say this isn't only unique to downtown Manhattan, and then you go further than that. In other words, we don't want to add to the violence in any kind of way. And then within days we were already going into a next level of violence which was virtually unparalleled in the species in terms of the unleashing of the war powers of the United States. And that's still part of it. That ability to empathize as human beings, that this happens here and it's happened to other people, just goes right past. It's not the first time in history that's happened, nor will it be the last. But there's also that side where it's not forgotten. It's unyieldingly fixed. It's unyieldingly present. It's in the psyche. It's in the human psyche. It's in the American psyche.
Well, Battery Park City, which is right across the street from the World Trade Center.
They were evacuated, right?
They were. They fled for their lives. You hear account after account of people being in their buildings, seeing the buildings burn outside their window, feeling the heat through their window.
There are two things you should know about this cloud. One, it isn't only ash and soot, but metal, glass, concrete, and flesh. Two, soon, any one of these pieces of metal, glass, or concrete might go through you.
When the buildings collapsed, people's windows were blown in. If they were fleeing, you have these heartrending stories of parents with their children running for the waterfront to escape, looking behind them and seeing this massive wall of dust coming. And a couple of people that I knew said, you know, I saw this wall of smoke coming at me, and I thought to myself, when it reaches us, there'll be no air, and I'm going to die with my children. And you know, even now, 10 years later, it's very emotional for me to hear that story.
Sobre esse aterro surgiu novo bairro, Battery Park City. a construção das Torres Gêmeas, milhões de toneladas de terra foram escavadas e jogadas no rio Hudson. Quando as torres caíram, os moradores tiveram que fugir da nuvem de detritos, atravessando o rio para sobreviver. Só puderam voltar meses depois. O bairro gêmeo do World Trade Center é também gêmeo na dor e na recuperação.
And so what the community went through was very, very dramatic. And it was probably the one neighborhood where, while the rest of the country felt the effects of September 11th emotionally, their lives were disrupted physically for months afterwards. They couldn't get back into the buildings. When they got back in, they couldn't drive there. Other visitors couldn't come into the neighborhood. They had nowhere to get groceries. They had nowhere to get medication. They had nowhere to do the simplest sorts of activities. Their subway stops were closed. So they were in a day-to-day very difficult position that I think the rest of the country, despite their sympathy, didn't experience. I think there are some important lessons to be learned that we can think about applying to all sorts of disasters and difficult conditions, whether they're terrorist attacks or hurricanes. One of the most important ones is that this neighborhood benefited a great deal from being able to recover in their own community with the people that they knew. If you think about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in the south of the United States, the people who were flooded there were dispersed all over the country, and so they were left to recover all alone. And the research that we see coming out of that event suggests that so much of the difficulty people are having to this day is because of their isolation. Whereas in Battery Park City, within a few weeks or a few months, people were able to move back. And you saw the way in which being part of this community made an immense difference.
10 years later, what are the scars that 9/11 left?
Well, you know, I think when it happened, we thought it was something that we were never going to forget. And 10 years later, one of the things that I think is perhaps most distressing is that that slogan, "Never Forget," is misleading. And so already something is happening that I think New Yorkers never imagined would happen, which is that the event is leaving our actual memory and changing into something that is being memorialized, that's being retold, that's being recreated. That something that was so raw and so immediate for people who were here on that day is, if not yet being mythologized, being separated from our everyday experience. And I think that that's difficult in a couple of ways. I mean, one, it's very disturbing to feel something like that drift away, people who lost people, feeling that distance grow. I think that it also means that we need to think a little bit more about what that event means. At least in New York, it's funny, I think, to an international audience, the U.S.'s military response afterwards makes it sound as though the U.S. was very attentive to it as a terrorist attack, as an attack on the United States, as sort of a militaristic event. Inside the United States, it felt like a personal tragedy.
What do you think has changed in society in a deep level?
Yeah. After September 11th, what everyone in the United States said is nothing will ever be the same.
Yeah.
That we're changed forever. And to a social scientist, after you get over the immediate grief, that's an interesting research question. Has everything changed? Will everything be different forever? And I used some research by a man named Robert Putnam who had looked at the effect of World War II and had looked at the way in which there was much greater public participation, civic participation in the U.S. in the years after World War II, and it diminished since then. And so when you look at the U.S. and see that parents' involvement in schools has declined over the decades, that civic involvement has declined, that voting membership has declined, that participation in sports leagues has declined, that all of these examples of public involvement have declined, he concluded that about half of that was the result of the increase in participation that came from the shared sacrifice of World War II, and that as that generation died off, we lost that very committed, very publicly invested generation. And so what we could expect from September 11th is that public participation would rise temporarily nationwide, but because it was not a long-term sacrifice, that was going to be a short-term thing. And indeed, that is what we found. That in the country as a whole, people really wanted to help after September 11th. They wanted to make sacrifices. They wanted to come together. But that feeling diminished. You know, there was a half-life of about a month, and each month it was about half as strong as it was before. In Lower Manhattan, had the only neighborhood that was physically disrupted by September 11th on a day-to-day basis for months and even years afterwards. And what I found was that in that neighborhood alone, you did have this long-term change. You saw a neighborhood that, as people said, became more of a real community, and residents were surprised that this horrible event had unexpectedly had this positive after effect. And I think that made a big difference.
God, my daughter thought it was over. Absolutely had to be. What am I supposed to feel?
12 de setembro de 2011, o Day After. Nova York, diante da encruzilhada. Poderia virar uma fortaleza, a segurança, o policiamento, a guerra ao terror acima de tudo. Ou poderia virar uma cidade mais humana e solidária. Fiel à vocação de porto de entrada, aberto às massas famintas que buscam refúgio no novo mundo. A tensão entre esses dois caminhos opostos continua 10 anos depois. Nova York é hoje uma cidade mais humana, verde e saudável. E isso tem a ver com 11 de setembro. Muitos jovens reagiram ao clima de medo e ao excesso de segurança e policiamento usando a bicicleta para retomar as ruas. As manifestações de ciclistas foram reprimidas, muitos foram presos, mas eles acabaram ganhando a parada. Hoje a cidade tem centenas de quilômetros de ciclovias. Mais gente na rua, mobilização popular, a força dos jovens. Esta é uma das respostas de Nova York à guerra e ao terror.
I've been arrested 6 times on the ride, and the cops went on an arresting binge between 2004 and 2006. Basically wanting to crush the ride. The reason why is because this is non-permitted. We don't have a planned route, and the NYPD likes to control everything, and they like to control where and when people move, and they don't like people doing things without their permission.
I think that's one of the ways that New York City has changed over the last 10 years, is that they've tried to justify an encroachment, a crackdown on public space under the guise of protecting us from terrorism. Now, part of me, in the back of my mind, I mean, I know in American history we have McCarthyism, we have Red Scares. Whenever the state comes along and says, I want to protect you by taking your freedom away, I get a little scared. Right? It's like your parents might have said, I'm doing this for your own good, so I'm beating you up a little bit. It doesn't really inspire confidence. And so what we have in New York over the last 10 years is this, every time the city tries to push, we try and push back in a creative way. Because if we use force, if we wear a black mask over our face and look menacing, they're going to easily arrest us. So we have to try and do something else. We'll dress like, if we're trying to preserve the community gardens, instead of saying, sir, please save the community gardens, we will dress like a tomato or a sunflower and go to City Hall and lobby dressed like a sunflower. Now, nobody can be as scared of a sunflower.
Durante anos, as manifestações de ciclistas movimentaram a cidade. Um protesto deles contra a convenção do Partido Republicano, em 2004, terminou com 400 presos. Eles acabaram ganhando na justiça e receberam $1 milhão de indenização pelas prisões arbitrárias.
Well, the city has harassed cyclists. The city has harassed anti-war activists. I mean, I remember when I was finishing my graduate work, I was going up. The war had just started, and we were all going to go to the Carlyle Group, which is a defense contracting group that I think Bush Sr. Is on the board of, and John Major is on the board of. A lot of the Saudi Arabian family are on the board, and so we were dressed like vampires to say, this is great, war profiteering, you know, more death, more war. I mean, Boeing's stock was going through the roof, and I have never seen us get arrested on the streets so fast as us dressed like vampires in front of the Carlyle building. We didn't even have time to disperse. If they'd said, we're going to arrest you, I would have said, okay, I'll see you later.
You know, the Chinese have a saying, the brush of a butterfly's wing changes the world. And so all the events that happen anywhere in the world will have some effect on us, whether we know it or not. And so for me,
I summon up in my mind a place where my thoughts will find yours. No, nothing is going to happen to you.
Found myself very saddened on October 7th of 2011, which was the day we started bombing Afghanistan. That was my brother's birthday. And it was also in the Christian tradition what we call Worldwide Communion Sunday. So we're celebrating this act of connection with everybody who is Christian through the world. It's my brother's birthday and we're bombing Afghanistan. And that's when it came together. I really wanted to do something.
Esta igreja metodista fica em Cabul, Afeganistão. Não física, mas espiritualmente. O prédio está num subúrbio de Nova Jersey, pertinho de Nova York, mas em espírito está no Afeganistão. É que a reverenda Myrna Betke, que pastoreia os fiéis daqui, encontrou em Cabul o sentido da vida. Myrna perdeu o irmão caçula, Bill. O Boeing, pilotado por Mohammed Atta, entrou pela janela da sala onde ele trabalhava. Myrna fundou um grupo de parentes dos mortos de 11 de setembro e foi para o Afeganistão. Lá conheceu as famílias das vítimas dos bombardeios americanos, da retaliação contra os atentados, e a vida dela mudou.
A group called Global Exchange was looking for a group of clergy, rabbis, imams to go to Afghanistan as part of an interfaith peace delegation. They heard about me through Peaceful Tomorrows and asked if I would go, and I did.
So your group was part, and yourself part, of that movement against the war in Afghanistan and also the war in Iraq, right?
Peaceful Tomorrows has protested both wars, yes.
So how does it feel now, 10 years later, that those wars are still going on? There are American troops in both countries.
Reminder that we have a long way to go in terms of bringing about alternative means other than violence to solve problems that in the long run violence doesn't work. It may seem the simple thing, but the long run needs relationship building, community building, offering hospitality to one another, learning about each other, and looking for ways to bring about, I guess what I would call restorative justice rather than retaliation.
Do you feel that the American public has changed in that respect? Because in the beginning there was widespread support for war. How is it now?
I think everybody's getting, I feel like everybody's getting tired of trying to be at war all the time. I do sense that, and I think there's a lot of people who are not so much anti-war in our country, but they're tired of war, so let's end it and leave and get out. And then the question is, okay, we just can't walk out of a country that we've been fighting in for 10 years now because, you know, all the pieces fall on the ground and who's going to pick them up? But I think people are more tired of the war than anything else.
What was your reaction when you saw throngs of people in Manhattan and other places celebrating the death of bin Laden?
That was really hard for me because one of the things that we reacted to after 9/11 was getting some of the pictures from across the world of people coming together and celebrating 9/11. And to me, that's the same thing. You can't celebrate a death.
Todo 11 de setembro, o céu de Nova York é iluminado por duas torres de luz que sobem ali do lugar onde ficava o World Trade Center. É o Tribute in Light, tributo de luz. Para mim, de tudo que lembra o que aconteceu aqui, é o que me toca mais fundo.
The message I'm communicating, this beam of focused energy, no, I said no, I'm not going to allow anything to happen to you.
O arquiteto Gustavo Bonevard é um dos criadores do projeto. Gustavo, I was saying that this is what touches me more deeply, the Tibetan light. Why do you think that happened?
It seems to me that one of the things that's so wonderful about it is that it seems to be a sort of a blank slate, or almost a screen onto which people can project their own ideas. Because for some people it's very much a memorial that marks where these lives have passed. For other people it represents the souls rising to heaven. For some people it's a sort of a declaration of life and existence. It's able to receive lots of different meanings.
What is it for you?
Well, I know that when we first came up with the idea, it was the day after the event. And on the 12th, we sat here, actually, on the pier and sort of thought about it, and we were missing the images so much, the towers. And it's after having looked at them so much for the past day because of the event, it was almost like you would close your eyes and still see them.
How has the city done in those 10 years?
Oh, it's interesting because I'm a born and raised New Yorker. My parents were from Argentina, and I was born a year or so after they came from Argentina. And my household was very bicultural in a sense. But my New York, the way I experience it, is not so much the way people understand it in terms of popular popular knowledge, or what people think of New York as being very busy and very rushed and rude and stuff. I find New York to be a place with very friendly people and a very nice place. I do think that the event brought out an enormous sense of community and brought people together very much, and there was a wonderful sense. In the end, I mean, New York is a very wonderful, strong, vibrant place, and I think that we've changed, but sort of assimilated the events and are moving on, and the towers being constructed, things are moving forward. So I think it's an important event in New York's history, of course, but New York continues to go on as New York.
Chegou o Mitsubishi ASX.